When you cut off contact with a narcissistic woman, the first and most immediate shock she experiences is the sudden loss of what psychologists call narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is not simply attention. It is far more fundamental than that. It is the emotional fuel that maintains her internal sense of identity. Compliments, admiration, emotional reactions, arguments, even your frustration, these all serve the same purpose. They confirm to her that she is significant, powerful, and psychologically central in someone else's life. To understand the intensity of her reaction, you must recognize that a narcissistic personality does not maintain a stable sense of self in the same way a psychologically grounded person does. Instead, her identity is constructed through external reflection. In simple terms, she knows who she is by watching how others respond to her. Your attention becomes a mirror, and through that mirror, she continuously rebuilds her self-image. Now imagine what happens when that mirror suddenly disappears. When you stop responding, when you withdraw your attention completely, you remove the very mechanism through which she stabilizes her inner world. From the outside, it may appear as though you have simply ended communication. But internally, what she experiences is something closer to psychological deprivation. The steady stream of validation, emotional engagement, and control that once regulated her ego abruptly collapses. This creates a state of deep internal anxiety. Without supply, her mind begins searching desperately for ways to restore that lost source of psychological energy. This is why you often see sudden attempts to re-enter your life, unexpected messages, emotional appeals, dramatic accusations, or even calculated provocations. These are not random reactions. They are attempts to restore the flow of narcissistic supply that once kept her internal structure intact. And this is where many people misunderstand the power of silence. When you refuse to re-engage, you are not merely ending a relationship. You are removing the stage upon which her identity was being performed. And once the stage is gone, the performance can no longer continue. To understand the second shock that occurs when you cut off contact, you have to look at the narcissistic relationship as a system built around control. For a narcissistic woman, control is not simply about dominating conversations or winning arguments. It is about maintaining psychological authority over the emotional environment of the relationship. She studies reactions carefully. She learns what triggers your guilt, what earns your sympathy, what provokes your anger, and what keeps you emotionally engaged. Over time, this allows her to shape the rhythm of the connection. In her mind, the dynamic becomes predictable. If she withdraws affection, she expects you to chase. If she criticizes you, she expects you to defend yourself. If she threatens distance, she assumes you will attempt to repair things. Each of these reactions reinforces her belief that she holds the emotional steering wheel. But the moment you cut off contact completely, something very unusual happens within this psychological system. The pattern breaks. Suddenly, the responses she has learned to rely on are gone. There is no defense, no argument, no pleading, no attempt to explain yourself. Instead, she encounters something she rarely faces: silence. And silence is profoundly destabilizing for someone whose entire strategy depends on predictable emotional reactions. In psychological terms, This creates a collapse of perceived authority. The narcissistic mind struggles with the idea that someone she once influenced has now stepped outside the structure entirely. It contradicts the internal narrative she has constructed, the belief that she ultimately dictates the emotional direction of the relationship. This is why cutting contact can provoke such extreme reactions. It is not only the loss of attention that disturbs her, it is the loss of certainty. She can no longer predict you, manage you, or emotionally position herself above you. The dynamic she believed she controlled has suddenly escaped her reach. And when control disappears, the narcissistic psyche begins scrambling to restore it through persuasion, manipulation, anger, or dramatic attempts to pull you back into the old pattern. But here lies the deeper lesson. The moment you refuse to play the role she assigned to you is the moment her control ends. Now we come to something even deeper, something far more painful for the narcissistic psyche than the loss of attention or control. When you cut off contact, you trigger what psychologists often describe as a narcissistic injury. This is not a simple emotional wound like disappointment or rejection. It is an injury to the very structure of the narcissist's ego. To understand this, we must recognize that a narcissistic personality is built upon a carefully constructed image of superiority. On the surface, she may appear confident, charming, even untouchable. But beneath that surface lies an ego that is far more fragile than it appears. The grand image she presents to the world must constantly be reinforced by external validation. Without that reinforcement, the structure begins to weaken. When someone she once controlled or manipulated suddenly walks away, and not only walks away, but does so without begging, without pleading, without seeking closure, it creates a contradiction the narcissistic mind struggles to process. In her internal narrative, she is the one who leaves. She is the one who decides when relationships begin and end. That belief protects her sense of superiority. But your silence challenges that narrative directly. The moment she realizes that you chose to step away on your own terms, her ego experiences a kind of shock. It raises a question that the narcissistic psyche tries desperately to avoid. What if I was not as powerful as I believed? This is what makes the injury so intense. It forces her, even if only briefly, to confront the possibility that her influence over you was never as absolute as she imagined. And for someone whose identity depends on maintaining an image of control and desirability, that realization is deeply destabilizing. The mind then reacts defensively. It may rewrite the story, convince itself that you were weak, ungrateful, or incapable of appreciating her value. These mental defenses are not random. They are attempts to repair the damaged ego. But the truth remains quietly in the background. When someone you once controlled chooses peace over your presence, the illusion of your power begins to crack. After the shock of losing supply, after the collapse of control, and after the sting of narcissistic injury, another pattern often begins to emerge, an intense and sometimes relentless obsession with reclaiming power. This stage reveals something important about the narcissistic psyche. It does not easily accept unfinished dominance. In her internal logic, the relationship may be over, but the psychological hierarchy must remain intact. She must still be the one who stands above the situation. So when you cut off contact, her mind begins searching for ways to reverse the dynamic. At first, this may appear subtle, a sudden message that seems reflective or apologetic, a carefully worded attempt to reopen communication. Perhaps she presents herself as calmer, wiser, or emotionally changed. These gestures can look sincere on the surface, but psychologically, they often serve a different purpose: to reopen the door so that control can quietly be restored. If these attempts fail, the strategies may shift. The tone might become more emotional, expressions of sadness, confusion, or longing. In some cases, guilt is introduced, reminders of memories, sacrifices, or moments meant to make you question your decision. The goal is not necessarily reconciliation in the healthy sense. The deeper goal is to provoke a response, because once you respond, the dynamic begins to move again, and movement means influence. If persuasion does not work, frustration may appear. The narcissistic mind becomes increasingly focused on regaining the psychological upper hand. This is why you sometimes see dramatic shifts: kindness turning into anger, affection transforming into accusations. What looks like emotional instability is often the result of a mind rapidly cycling through strategies in search of the one that restores control. From the outside, it can feel confusing, even overwhelming. But when you understand the pattern, the behavior becomes clearer. The obsession is not about love in the deeper sense. It is about unfinished power. And this is the crucial realization: the more you refuse to re-enter the game, the more the obsession reveals itself. Because nothing frustrates a manipulator more than a person who simply stops playing.
When the attempts to regain control begin to fail, when the messages go unanswered, when the emotional hooks no longer pull you back into the conversation, another shift often occurs. What was once persuasion can quickly transform into rage. This reaction may seem extreme, even confusing, especially if the person once presented herself as calm, charming, or emotionally composed. But psychologically, this moment reveals something that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. For a narcissistic personality, rejection is rarely processed in a calm or reflective way. Instead, it threatens the carefully protected image of superiority that holds the ego together. When she realizes that you are no longer responding to her influence, the situation becomes deeply threatening to that internal structure. And when the ego feels threatened, the mind often moves into defense. One of the most common defenses is the sudden reversal of narrative. Instead of acknowledging that you chose to walk away, the story may be rewritten in a way that protects her self-image. You may suddenly become the villain in her version of events, the ungrateful partner, the selfish one, the person who changed or betrayed her trust. This rewriting of the story is not simply about convincing others. It is also about convincing herself. In some cases, this defense takes the form of what psychologists call a smear campaign. She may begin sharing selective details, distorted memories, or outright fabrications about the relationship. The goal is twofold: to damage your credibility and to restore her own sense of moral and emotional superiority. If others believe the story, then the injury to her ego feels less severe. At the same time, you may notice emotional volatility, anger, accusations, sudden hostility that seems disproportionate to the situation. These reactions are not random explosions of feeling. They are the psychological aftershocks of a collapsing narrative, the mind struggling to rebuild a sense of power after losing control of the relationship. But here is the paradox that many people fail to recognize. The louder the accusations become, the more they reveal the depth of the wound. Because when someone truly moves on with peace, they do not need to destroy your name to survive your absence. After all the attempts to regain supply, after the strategies to restore control, after the emotional reactions and the rewriting of the story, something quietly powerful begins to take shape on your side of the equation, and that power lies in something deceptively simple. Your silence. Silence, in this context, is not weakness. It is not avoidance, and it is not a passive act. Psychologically, silence becomes one of the most disruptive forces you can introduce into a narcissistic dynamic. Why? Because the entire structure of that relationship depended on your participation. Every argument, every explanation, every emotional reaction once served as a thread that kept the connection alive. When you remove those reactions, you remove the emotional feedback loop that once sustained the dynamic. For the narcissistic mind, this absence of response creates a kind of psychological void. It cannot easily categorize you anymore. You are no longer the person who defends yourself, the person who tries to fix things, or the person who reacts emotionally to accusations. In a sense, you step outside the role that had been assigned to you in the relationship, and that is deeply unsettling for someone who depends on predictable emotional responses. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of individuation, the process by which a person steps away from unconscious patterns and begins to act from a place of inner awareness. When you maintain your silence and refuse to re-enter the cycle of manipulation, you are doing exactly that. You are choosing clarity over chaos, self-respect over emotional entanglement. What many people fail to realize is that the narcissistic dynamic survives through engagement. Even conflict can keep it alive, but indifference, true emotional detachment, removes the energy that once fueled the entire system. Over time, something profound begins to happen. The psychological grip that once held you weakens, the urgency fades, the emotional confusion clears, and the narcissistic individual who once relied on your reactions is left facing something they rarely encounter, your complete independence. And perhaps that is the final lesson. The moment you stop feeding a destructive dynamic is the moment you begin reclaiming your own power.